It is 7 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for another installment of History of the Gunnison Country with Duane Vandenbusche, our state historian as of Saturday, correct, Duane?
Yeah, Saturday I assumed the reins for a year.
All right, fantastic. We are recording all of these sessions. They are available on our website, crestviemuseum.com. They're on our homepage. They're in the right-hand column. Just scroll down a little bit and you'll be able to find them all there. Please consider making a donation to support this programming. Part of your donation will go to the Duane Vandenbusche Education Scholarship for a local student so that they have a little extra college funds going into school next year. You can post questions in the chat. Many of you have also found the Q&A, which we'll also answer at the end of the session. So we'll have plenty of time at the end to answer any questions you guys have. Keep saying hey in the chat. It's good to know where everybody's from as well. Again, please consider becoming a member. Please consider signing up for our newsletter and everything you can find at crestviemuseum.com. When you're a member, you're the first one to find out about stuff like this. You also get great discounts on all of our other events. We're thinking about a quasi-virtual activity pub crawl that allows distancing. We also have some trivia nights starting to come up. We're making all kinds of plans for the fall and for the winter. And of course, Duane's sessions go all the way through the fall as well. With that, I will pass it off to you, Duane.
Thank you, Nell, and welcome everybody. Great to have everybody on board. Nell tells me we got over 300 people registered, so we're doing very well, and we appreciate you being on. Next week, we'll be talking about Monarch Country. A lot of people come off of Monarch Pass and head towards Salida and really don't know a whole lot about the fantastic history that existed. So you're going to hear a little bit next week about Salida, Poncha Springs, Maysville, Garfield, Monarch, the 3 Monarch Passes, a lot of different characters, the limestone quarry, and we'll have a lot of photographs also, as we will tonight. Now, we also always like to give a trivia question, and then I'll give one of my books to whoever answers the trivia question first. So here it comes. I've got a book out. It's called Around Monarch. So we're going to talk about the Monarch Country next week. But the trivia question this week is, many movies have been partly or completely made in the Gunnison Country about the West and the cattle industry. First one to come up with the answer of one of those movies is going to get Around Monarch Pass for next week. So I'll let Nell take care of that.
First one's to post in the chat. I won't see it in the Q&A in time, but in the chat.
Okay, any answers yet, Nell?
We've got True Grit.
I know True Grit wasn't made. It was made up in Ridgeway, though, close. Any others?
Okay. Those are the only 2 answers so far.
Okay. Well, we'll wait on that. As soon as we get in the middle, you let me know what's going on. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about ranching in the Gunnison Country, but I'm going to give you a little preview of ranching in the West before we get over there. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, there was a tremendous demand for fresh beef. Admiral Grant and David Farragut, Admiral Farragut had blockaded the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, which means that the South couldn't use the river. So they weren't going to trade beef or sell beef to the North, and they couldn't get it to the South. And as a result, 5 million Texas cows grew up near the towns of Bandera and Laredo, Texas, along the banks of the Nueces River in the southern part of the state. And they were worth nothing. Actually, one of the ranchers out there, Sam Maverick, would get his cattle out of his grass and shoo them onto other guys' grass, and an unwanted cow became known as a maverick, and we use that expression today. There is a photo of the cattle pens, actually, when they got the cattle shipped out a little later on. An Illinois meat dealer right after the Civil War, John McCoy, knew that if you could ever get those cows, which were worth practically nothing in South Central Texas, to a railhead, and then the railroad take them to a meatpacking center like Omaha, Kansas City, St. Louis, Denver, or Omaha, you can make a lot of money. But nobody knew if you could drive cows on a trail that far. In 1866, the year after the Civil War, McCoy gathered 3,000 cows and drove those cows with about 10 cowboys to a railhead at a town called Sedalia, Missouri. And at Sedalia, the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad ran there, and that connected to the railroad out in Chicago. Now, the Sedalia Trail was not a very good trail because you had electrical storms, you went through the Ouachita Mountains, and you went through settled farming land. And when those cattle broke down barbed wire fences, irate farmers shot the hell out of the cows. But the cows that McCoy did get to Sedalia, Missouri, sold at $35 a cow. At the most, he paid for the cows $1 a cow in Texas. So needless to say, after you paid the cowboys off and took care of the horses, the profit was enormous. And that gave a lot of people an idea. So the Sedalia Trail lasted for about a year. But the following year, 3 Great Western cattle trails began to get underway. One of them was the Western Cattle Trail, and they all ran from Bandera and Laredo along the Nueces River in southern Texas. And this one ran into Nebraska at a place called Ogallala, where a railroad had been built, and that was the end of track as the transcontinental railroads were building out to the west. Another trail opened up called the Chisholm Trail, named for a great Texas rancher named Jesse Chisholm. And this one ran to an end of track at Dodge City in Kansas. And the third cattle trail was run by a great Texas rancher named Clyde Goodnight and a meat dealer named William Loving, hence the name, the Goodnight Loving Trail. And that one ran to Santa Rosa, New Mexico. And all of those cows were now fattened up during the summer and then put on railroads and taken out to the meatpacking centers that I've just mentioned. Now, here are some of the things that the cattle trails had in common. And you're looking at a guy right there off a great Charlie Russell painting. He's riding drag. And that's why he's got that scarf on, because of the dust. He's trying to keep all the stragglers in order on a cattle drive. The average cattle drive had 3,000 cows and averaged 10 cowboys, 1 cowboy for 300 cows, 30 to 60 horses. That means 3 to 6 horses for each cowboy. You had the remuda. 1 guy was in charge of the horse herd or the remuda. 2 guys were in charge of the chuck wagon. And 1 guy was the trail boss who made $125 a month. Each cowboy made $30 a month. But you got your room and board. And of course, your room was sleeping on the hard ground, and your board were bacon and beans every day. The cattle drive began in March and ended in May, usually took about 100 days. And it was dangerous. Indian problems, weather problems, but the most important cause of death, the thing that caused more death than anything was drowning. Because the cowboys didn't know how to swim and they had all kinds of equipment on, and the rivers were swollen in the spring of the year. So if your horse stumbled and went down in the South Platte River, which was swollen with water, you're probably going to drown. Usually out of the 3,000 cows, 2,800 made them to the end of track. The others you had to pay off the Indians, or they got lost, a whole bunch of problems. But let's say you got 2,800 there and you sold them at $35 a cow. So it cost you about $3,000 for 3,000 cows in South Central Texas, and you sold them for $100,000. Enormous profits were made. And the great cattle industry was underway in the West. Now, three things had to happen for the success of the cattle industry. Number one, Indian removal. And you're looking at the Indian teepees at the Los Pinos Indian Agency in the Gunnison Country. The second thing that had to happen was buffalo herds had to be eliminated. And so-called sportsmen and buffalo hunters reduced 13 million buffalo down to 10,000 by the year 1890. And the cattle took over grazing on the grass. Now you're looking at a picture of the Indians on Main Street, Gunnison, and the guy in the middle is Chief Uray, and the guy second from right is Otto Mears. And this is 1881 in Gunnison. And the third thing that had to happen for the cattle industry to be successful was railroads had to come so you could get those cows to market. By the year 1884, 5.2 million cows had been trailed into Colorado, which had cool climate, great gamma grass and buffalo grass near the Texas cattle herds and also on railroads. Now you saw, go back to that previous picture, if you will, Nell. There's another great picture by a man named W.H. Corner. And this is what happened in the wintertime is you tried to find new range. And these are guys trying to keep the cattle moving up in Montana. Go to the next one now. And this is an end of track in New Mexico, where cattle are going on the Goodnight Loving Trail. They're going to be loaded up and taken into the end of a track or into the major meatpacking centers that we've already talked about. Great cattle barons came because of the open range in Colorado. John W. Iliff, 35,000 cows on 9 ranches, controlling 700,000 acres from Greeley to Julesburg along the South Platte River. John Wesley Prowers, 1 million acres controlled in southeastern Colorado. John Brush, Colorado today in the South Platte River, 10,000 cows. And Sam Hartzell in South Park. If you go on Highway 24 going towards Colorado Springs, you're going to go through that little town called Hartzell, and he controls South Park with over 10,000 shorthorns running on the open range in South Park. The Longhorns, which had been the first cattle, were soon replaced by Shorthorns because the Shorthorns had more beef. The Western slope cattle industry began to open up in the mid-1870s with the coming of great silver and gold mining camps in the Gunnison Country, in the San Juan, in the Roaring Fork, and in the Blue River areas. Ranchers now made a tremendous amount of money by supplying the mining camps with herds. And the herds, of course, were in South Park and in the Roaring Fork, the Gunnison Valley, Animas River, the Uncompahgre, and the Colorado River country. So with thousands of people in these mining camps, they wanted fresh beef and they paid good prices for it. Ranching in eastern Colorado has several advantages. Cool climate, high buffalo and gamma grass that fed 13 million buffalo for centuries now did the same thing for cows, very close to the Texas cattle herds and thousands of these new arrivals in the mining camps. In the year 1877, John Wesley Powell wrote a paper called Arid Regions of the West. And I like to say that nobody ever understood the American West and Colorado like John Wesley Powell, who made 4 points. Number one, he said, there's not plenty more where that came from. We got to protect our lumber and our land and our water in the West. They are not inexhaustible. Number two, much of the land in Colorado and the West should be retired from farming because of a lack of water. The natural way of making a living was ranching. And finally, Powell said that the Homestead Act, giving people 160 acres of land basically free in Colorado and the West, didn't work because you'd be lucky to raise 1 cow on 160 acres of arid lands in the West. And then a guy named John Wesley, a man named Walter Prescott Webb. young professor, University of Texas, 1922, read a book by a guy named Emerson Hough. And Emerson Hough, in The Way West, the name of the book said that the West had been settled by the axe, the rifle, and the horse, and the boat. And Walter Prescott Webb at the University of Texas said, it may have been settled by the rifle and the horse, but it sure as hell wasn't settled by the axe and the boat, because you don't have any timber out on the Great Plains or eastern Colorado, and there are no navigable rivers. And as a result, he wrote one of the great books describing the American West called The Great Plains, in which he basically said that anybody moving west of the Mississippi River and trying to farm or make a living the way they had east of the Mississippi would be doomed to failure. Ranchers on the western slope and in the Gunnison Country now did yeoman work. They cleared sagebrush and willows and began to dig irrigation ditches that lead to the great hay meadows that we have today. I've got pictures of the Gunnison Country in the 1870s, and all you see is a bunch of sagebrush. And the only grass is right alongside of the Gunnison River or whatever stream you have. And then you had a lot of willows and maybe a few trees. Women worked right alongside the men. One of the legendary ranchers in the state of Colorado on the western slope was a woman named Marie Scott with her Alpine Wet Meadows Ranch out of Ridgeway. She eventually owned most of the land from Dallas Divide to Utah, 80,000 acres. If a pile of dirt was for sale, one rancher said, Marie Scott would buy it. During the great era of ranching, the Roundup Law and Stray Day came, and the Colorado Stock Growers Association began in 1867 to stop rustling, wipe out predators, lobby for good laws, oppose sheep, and stop overgrazing. There's a famous story. There's a bunch of sheep grazing up Ohio Creek. There's a famous story of a sheriff in northwestern Colorado around Craig, an ex-sheriff, being hired to stop rustling, paid $500 a month by the ranchers. 6 months later, they got him together and they said, we already paid you $3,000 to stop rustling, and the rustling is still ongoing. What the hell's going on? And the sheriff said to the ranchers, if I put every person in jail that I knew was rustling, all of you guys would be in jail. They're rustling from each other. One rancher said when he was invited to a neighbor for dinner, he said, I wasn't too damn sure I wasn't eating my own beef. The Roundup Law meant that you had to have a roundup to make sure that all the cows are branded. Stray Day involved any cattle that had strayed from one valley to another. So if you got cattle with a Delta County brand and Delta County's got some with a Gunnison brand, you kept theirs and they kept yours. That was Stray Day. By the mid-1880s, the great days of cattle ranching in the West on the Great Plains and in eastern Colorado had ended. It was a great 23-year period in history, 1865 to 1888, and then it was all over. And here are the reasons why it ended. Number one was the overgrazing of the range. Number two was the Homestead Act and barbed wire fences. A man named John F. Glidden of DeKalb County, Illinois, had invented barbed wire in 1874. The cowboys called it the Devil's Hat Band. During storms, cattle in the open range would keep moving with their backs to the storm. They'd go with the wind and they'd survive. Now they began to pile up right near barbed wire fences and they froze standing up. The third thing that led to the end of the cattle industry was state quarantine laws, which stopped Texas cattle herds from coming in with Texas tick fever and hoof and mouth disease. So they weren't allowed to come in what they called north of 36 parallel. The fourth thing was the federal government reinforced laws involving water in the Homestead Act. The fifth thing was the introduction of fine wool merino sheep, 2 million of them in Colorado by the 1880s. And you made more money off the sheep than you could off cattle. And finally, and this was the clincher, two tremendous back-to-back winters of 85, 86, and 86, 87. In those winters, 75% of all the cows died in Colorado and on the Great Plains. The cowboys would refer to this from that time on as the Great Die-Up. And anytime there was a bad winter, they would always refer and say, back in 86, hearkening back to the days of those tremendous winters. Even though the industry on the Great Plains in eastern Colorado was wiped out by 1887, the western slope cattle industry in the Gunnison Country began to boom. The #1 shipping point for cattle in the United States by 1900 was Steamboat Springs. Plenty of water, irrigated hay fields, and a great market for beef from those booming mining camps, the western slope did very well. The top areas included northwestern Colorado along the Yampa River, where a man named John Rolfe Burroughs wrote, "Where the Old West stayed young." Now there are a bunch of powder horn cattle being driven into the railhead at Gunnison, and that's about 4 miles west of Gunnison, about where Lee Span's ranch is today. Another area, and a famous one, was the Gunnison Country. And another one was the Uncompahgre Country and the Animas River Valley and around Durango, the Colorado River Country and the Roaring Fork. All had great cattle herds. The coming of the railroads into western Colorado was another major reason for the booming cattle industry. The Denver Rio Grande arrived in 1881. The Denver South Park arrived in 1882. And then the famous Moffett line of David Moffett went all the way up into Craig after the turn of the century. And that's why Steamboat was the #1 shipping point. The first cattle shipped out of western Colorado were shipped out by Montrose rancher William Boot, 2 carloads in 1882 on the Rio Grande over Marshall Pass and into the Denver stockyards. You're looking there at a great picture of the Powder Horn area very early, and those cows are being moved out on the pool and headed out towards one of the ends of track. 2 federal acts in the 20th century had a big impact on the cattle industry in the Gunnison Country in western Colorado. One was the Newlands Act of 1901, which created the Bureau of Reclamation. That was set up to reclaim arid lands in western Colorado and in the west. The idea was if taxpayer money could be used to build river and harbor bills out in the east, and by God, you could use western or taxpayer money to reclaim western lands and Gunnison Country lands out in the west. The first project was the Uncompahgre project, or the building of the Gunnison Tunnel from 1904 to 9, which diverted Gunnison River water out of the Black Canyon in a 6-mile underground tunnel under Vernal Mesa and into the Uncompahgre Valley. That project saved Delta, Montrose, Olathe, Kelowna, and Ridgeway, and gave the Uncompahgre Valley enough water for agriculture and for irrigated hay meadows. Now there's a great shot of loading hay on the Allen Ranch in the 1950s. And you notice they got a photographer there filming it on the left. The Bureau of Reclamation would go on to build many more projects, including the Taylor Dam, which backed up the Taylor Reservoir. And there you've got a group of men making hay in the Taylor Park area after the building of the reservoir. Now, the Taylor Reservoir held 106,200 acre-feet of water, and it was built in 1937. The Taylor Dam built in 1937, and that water is owned by the Uncompahgre water users of Montrose. So they can call for the water, goes down the Taylor River, the Gunnison River, through the Gunnison Tunnel and into the Uncompahgre Valley. The other federal act created the United States Forest Service in 1905. And now for the first time, the federal government would control the land it owned. And 79% of all the land in the Gunnison Country is federal. the Forest Service now for the first time instituted fees for the use of the land for grazing. It told ranchers when they could put their cows on the land, when they had to take them off, and how much they had to pay per cow. The Forest Service Act and the Forest Service became very unpopular with ranchers, newspapermen, loggers, miners, and all who had used federal land without fees before. Many referred to the Forest Service as socialistic. But most of the ranchers that I talk today say that this was one of the best things that ever happened because the range began to get overgrazed, and now permits were needed. The Gunnison Country cattle industry went way back just before the Civil War, just after the Civil War, when a Texas cattleman named Clyde Goodnight, looking for more range, trailed 200 cows into the area. The next spring, every one of them were dead because of the hard winter. So Clyde Goodnight did not look for the Gunnison Country as cattle range. Alonzo Hartman declared this: some men had brought a bunch of longhorns in from Texas right during the Civil War, but the hard winter proved too much for them and they all perished. In 1869, before anybody really had come into the Gunnison Country, Charles and Mary Sewell came to the Tomechi Valley with 40 settlers, 9 miles east of Gunnison on the Tomechi. Sewell later recalled, and I'm quoting, "Trappers, fur buyers, and speculators drifted through the country, and the rich soil was settled by pioneers who built small huts constructed with dirt roofs to protect settlers from burning pitch snags shot from the bows of Indians as they rode by on their ponies in the night. No food was bought except flour and sugar, which came by the barrel by oxen or mule wagon. In the year 1868, a cow camp was established for the Los Pinos Indian Agency, 30 miles from Gunnison. And this came in 1868 to provide beef for the Ute Indians. The original herd was 640 cattle and 1,160 sheep. The two men initially in charge were Josiah White and Charles Perkins, and they were in charge of the camp at Dos Rios, right where the Gunnison and the Tomechi Creeks came together in 1868, and they were the first guys ever to put a hay crop up on the western slope. And you're looking there at a place called Kezar, 10 miles west of Gunnison, and you can see the stage ready to go out because the railroad hasn't yet gotten to Kezar, which was on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Alonzo Hartman came in to take charge of the cow camp in 1872. He rode in a driving blizzard on Christmas Day. And you can read about Hartman in a great book by Sidney Jochnick, who was a cook at that time at the cow camp called Early Days on the Western Slope. And there is Hartman and his wife, Annie Hagler. They were married in 1882 in Johnson County, Kansas. And Hartman is one of the two great fathers of the Gunnison Country. The other father of the Gunnison Country came in 1874, bringing 20 people in what he called the Gunnison Colony. He had been here the year before on a geological expedition, and he really liked the possibility of water and maybe irrigated hay meadows. And his name was Sylvester Richardson. He soon found that the growing season probably wasn't quite long enough to have great farming, so he advocated ranching. And in addition, he said this: an invasion of locusts and grasshoppers during 1876 and 77 wiped out most crops. They descended on the valley like a wild horde in the fall of 76, destroying all the crops and laying eggs for another brood, which wiped out all the crops the following year too. But The Gunnison Country cattle industry now entered a boom in the late 70s and the early 80s for the following reasons. Number one, the Ute Indians were moved out of here and moved out to Kelowna on the Uncompahgre River, and then they moved out of Colorado completely, the Uncompahgre Utes and the Northern Utes, by the year 1881. And this opened this area up for ranchers and maybe farmers. The second reason was the coming of the Denver and Rio Grande and Denver South Park railroads in 81 and 82. The third reason was the opening of great mining camps with thousands of miners and all of these individuals willing to pay high prices for fresh beef. The fourth reason was the irrigation and the building of ditches, which led to the great hay meadows that we have today. The fifth reason was weather, which seemingly eliminated farming. Now that is false. And I'm going to have a great presentation later on called Sustainability, in which I'll show you that farming always existed in the Gunnison Country, still exists today, and you can do it well. And you're looking there now at the Ohio Creek Valley with Mount Carbon in the background and hay cut in one of those great irrigated hay meadows. A sixth reason was the great bottomland in the different valleys of the Gunnison Country. East River, Slate, Ohio, Razor, Tamichi, Quartz, Cochito, Lake Fork, Powderhorn, and of course the Gunnison Valley. And lastly, 79% of the land in the Gunnison Country is federal, and that was used by ranchers with permits for grazing. The largest cattle herd ever owned by one man in the Gunnison Country was owned by a cattleman named Bill Snyder around 1910. 2,500 shorthorn cows, which grazed from Stubbs Gulch around W Mountain all the way up to Marshall Pass near Sargent's. When the Utes were moved out of Los Pinos, Alonzo Hartman took up the first major ranch in the Gunnison Country of Dos Rios, right where the 13th green is at the Dos Rios Golf Course today. The words Dos Rios in Spanish meaning two rivers, the Tamichi and Gunnison coming together. By 1910, Gunnison County was one of the great cattle regions of the American West. 300 ranches, 40,000 cows, 10,000 horses, 1,000 hogs, 200 mules, and 80,000 tons of hay a year, with half of that hay sold for very good prices outside of the Gunnison Country. The Gunnison Stock Growers Association was founded in 1894 to fight the introduction of sheep. Two ranchers on the Cochito were expelled from the Stock Growers Association for having 4 domestic sheep. And one of them said to Alonzo Hartman, "I only have 4 domestic sheep." And Hartman said, 4 to grow from 4 can grow to 400. And then one of the cattlemen who had been expelled said to Hartman, "Have you ever eaten mutton?" And Alonzo Hartman said, "Yes, I have," he said, "but I'm damned ashamed of it." During the years before World War I, a tremendous cattle and sheep war came in the Gunnison Country and also up in northwestern Colorado over the open range. Now, this was part racial because the people who herded sheep were primarily Basque or Hispanic, but most often it was economic because both sides wanted the land to graze their sheep and their cattle. 3 big cattle sheep conflicts came in the Gunnison Country in which hundreds of sheep were killed. One of them was in Taylor Park when a Utah sheep herder tried to bring cows over Taylor Pass into the park. One was at Iola when hundreds of sheep were killed. And one of them was up Obie Joyful up above Crested Butte, where a forest ranger named William Kreitzer had a pistol stuck in his stomach, marched off into the timber and thought he was going to die. There are some families in the Gunnison Country today that do not talk to each other because of what happened in this cattle-sheep conflict. Eventually, William Kreitzer became one of the first forest rangers in Colorado, and he was in the Gunnison Country. And he told the ranchers who had hired people from the outside with horses, had been shod and masks over their faces, that the next time this happened, this was a federal offense, and they were going to go to jail if they could prove who did it. Eventually, Cimarron became an informal line. And you're looking at Cimarron right there in 1879 with cows rounded up. Anything west of Cimarron was sheep. Anything towards the Gunnison Country, east of Cimarron, that's cattle country. So from Cimarron to Montrose, you can run sheep. The Gunnison Country is going to be cattle. And that's the informal line you're looking at right there at Cimarron. So every fall in October, Gunnison Country ranchers would get together in pools, and they would drive their cattle to the end of track. One of the famous pools was the Powderhorn Iola Pool, and they'd load them up on railroad cars and then ship them to the Denver stockyards. This is a shot of cowboys running cows on the pool in the Brush Creek area. The pools had names like Pie Plant, Taylor Park, Iola Powderhorn, Lake Fork, East Side and West Side. And there are cowboys from Powderhorn gathered together for a photograph before they drove cows on the Powderhorn Iola Pool out to Iola, where they were loaded up on the train to take out to the Denver stockyards. Water has always been vital to Gunnison Country ranches. One rancher in 1881 told another one, he said, "This would be a nice country if there were a little better society and plenty of water." His neighbor said, "Yes, and a little better society and plenty of water would make hell a paradise." There was another saying in the early days of the Gunnison Country that went like this: all one had to have to be a cowboy was guts and a horse. And with guts, you could steal the horse. World War I years, 1914 to 18, were great years for ranchers because of the great demand for beef. Now there you got a picture that is near Doyleville, and I grew up on a farm that used exactly that. And unfortunately, I was in the hay mow. You would have a hay loader loading loose hay onto a wagon. The wagon would then be underneath that treble hook. And that treble, go back to that other picture, Nell. And that treble hook would be put down on the hay wagon. And then it would take about 1/6 of the hay, bring it up to a rail, and you'd bring the rail over to about the middle of the hay mow and drop it. And then yours truly had a hook. And my job was to pull the hay off to the side. And it was the hottest. You got that chaff on your back from the alfalfa, one of the worst jobs in the world. And I got unpleasant memories of being up in the hay mow. Next photograph. And there is, they had all kinds of ways of loading hay in the Gunnison Country. And I'd have to ask the ranchers who were tuned in what they called that, but that's one of about 5 or 6 that they had, and this one is near Doyleville. The 1920s and 30s were very difficult times because of the end of World War I and the lessened demand for everything. And then came the stock market crash of October 1929, which led to the Great Depression. Now we've been talking about Doyleville, and there was the Doyleville Hotel in the early 1880s. Doyleville had a great history. There was no safety net in the 1930s, no Social Security, early in the 30s, no Social Security, no old age pensions, no unemployment compensation, no workman's compensation. You were on your own. And then to top it off, the years were very dry and hot. We've all heard of the Dust Bowl out on the Great Plains, and ranching was brought to the brink of collapse. Many ranches were lost early in the 1930s because the rancher couldn't pay off his mortgage. But then, and my father relayed this story to me about farms in Upper Michigan, and the same thing happened in Colorado and the Western Slope and the Gunnison Country with ranches. The sheriff would be at a ranch and an auctioneer to auction off that ranch because the rancher couldn't pay off his mortgage. And all of his the ranching friends would come in, and they had rifles and shotguns over the crock of their R. And they would tell the auctioneer and the sheriff, there is going to be one bid on this ranch. We're not going to screw around with tractors or wagons and horses and that kind of thing. And his neighbor is going to make that one bid. And anybody else who tries to bid, and if the sheriff interferes, they're going to shoot him. And they were desperate enough to shoot him. So there was one bid of $100 for the ranch. And then that rancher would pay that $100 off to his neighbor whenever he could. And all the fellow ranchers had gotten together and chipped in money for the $100. And that's how ranches were saved and farms were saved. And that's how desperate conditions were during those years of the 1930s. It was during the 1930s that the great writer John Steinbeck wrote of the plight of the people of the Dust Bowl who had to leave their ranches and farms and head to California, when he wrote The Grapes of Wrath. The great songwriter Woody Guthrie wrote a couple of songs about that dark time in American history. And one, in my opinion, ought to be the national anthem. And that one is This Land Is Your Land. And Woody Guthrie also wrote another song entitled So Long It's Been Good to Know You, as the people had to leave. Imagine living on a ranch in the Gunnison Country during the Depression. No market for your beef, no safety net, no electricity, very hot and dry weather. It's no wonder those people are referred to by Tom Brokaw and the other people who lived in the U.S. at the time of they are the greatest generation. They went through the Depression and World War II. So whenever we feel sorry about ourselves with the coronavirus today, you think of those people who went through a lot tougher times and a lot longer, about 20 years. In 1934, the federal government and the New Deal passed the Taylor Grazing Act. It was the brainchild of our representative, the Western Slope representative out of Glenwood Springs, Ed Taylor, who headed the House Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, responsible for all land and water legislation in the nation. That act took out 800 million acres of federal land, less desirable land, out of circulation. The land was arid, sagebrushy, alkali, and had been abused for years by ranchers, miners, timbermen, and others. Ed Taylor put in charge of the Taylor Grazing Act a rancher named Farrington Carpenter from Hayden, who I had the privilege to interview 4 times on his ranch at Hayden, one of the greatest guys I ever met. And Farrington Carpenter told me that as he took over as the head of the Taylor Grazing Act, he was going to have problems between ranchers and sheepmen over who got what right to graze, who got the permits. So he said, I called a big meeting in Glenwood Springs, and I made it known that anybody who wasn't there probably wasn't going to get a permit. And he said, I had the tables arranged in a circle, and I had nameplates. Nameplate of a cattleman, then a sheepman, then a cattleman. So all the cattlemen couldn't sit together and all the sheepmen couldn't sit together. And then he said to the group, fellows, he said, we got 2 questions to answer tonight. One I think we can answer in 17 seconds. The next one might take a little longer. The first question is this. The federal government has instructed me that if we do not decide amongst ourselves tonight who gets what, the federal government will make that decision. All in favor of the federal government, raise your hand. And not one hand went up. And Farrington Carpenter looked at his watch and said, well, that's about right, 17 seconds. We've answered the first question. Who's going to decide who gets what? Now let's decide who gets what. And that's how he did it. Later on, the Taylor Grazing Act became known as the Bureau of Land Management, and it is known today as the BLM. 6.5 million acres in Colorado were divided up into 6 districts, and they were controlled by fees and licenses. The Gunnison Country ranchers at first protested against the Bureau of Rec and the Forest Service and the Taylor Grazing Act, but I guarantee you today that almost all of them agree it was one of the best things that ever happened. One more thing came in the 1930s as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and that made things a lot better and easier for local ranchers, and that was the coming of electricity. In the 1930s, only Crested Butte and Gunnison had it. Anybody outside of those 2 towns did not, because there weren't enough people to make it profitable enough for the electric companies. And then came the REA, the Rural Electric Association. In 1930, 8 out of 9 people, ranchers in the Gunnison Country, did not have electricity. By 1940, 8 out of 9 did. As my father told me on our farm in Upper Michigan, and I say the ranchers would say the same thing, it was the greatest invention that ever came in the Gunnison Country. World War II, 1941 to 45, led to some of the best years again for Gunnison Country ranchers because, like World War I, of the high demand for beef. Prices for beef soared. And now we're going to have a collage of photographs that Nell is going to put up on the screen here. And this one happens to be of Jack's cabin in 1877 before the railroad came in. In the late 1940s, Dan and Jesse Thornton came to the Gunnison Country from Arizona. Dan was a rancher, but his wife really had the money. And they bought a ranch that today is north of Gunnison called Castle Mountain. And Dan Thornton and then other ranchers began to raise the best bred cattle in the nation. At his dispersal sale up Ohio Creek, Dan Thornton sold 2 bulls to an Argentinian investor in 1949 for $50,000 each. There is a haying scene with Tamichi Dome in the background along Tamichi Creek. And this was near the Waters Ranch where Dino Poloni used to ranch. Later on, 1 year after his dispersal sale, the Republican candidate for governor died unexpectedly in June. Dan Thornton became the choice of the Republicans, and he won in 1950 and was reelected again in 1952. Colorado governor, 1950 to 54. There's a shot in 1928 of the famous La Vida Hotel and the Denver Rio Grande Railroad right in front of it, and cowboys coming in, probably to do a little recreation. In 1950, the Ford Motor Company made a movie on Gus Roberson's ranch up Ohio Creek called The Great American Cowboy. We've got it in our library and it's great. Today, there are 50 ranches in the Gunnison Country and about 9,000 cows. A far cry from the 300 ranches and the 40,000 in 1910. There is a horse race right down Main Street in the 1880s during cattlemen's days. Ranching has been and is important to the Gunnison Country today for the following reasons in conclusion. 79% of all the land in the Gunnison Country is owned by the federal government. Absolutely indispensable to the ranchers. There is a quadrille on horseback. A quadrille is really 4 people engaging in a square dance. This is on horseback in the 1880s on Elk Avenue in Gunnison. The second reason that ranching is important in the Gunnison Country today is that 174,000 acres are ranched with 66,000 irrigated. Number 3, ranching is the oldest continuous industry in the Gunnison Country, going back to 1868. Number 4, the ranchers are the best environmentalists we have in the Gunnison Country because they stand in the way of development. And Bill Trampy and Susan Lohr a number of years ago created the Gunnison Ranch and Conservation Legacy that preserved ranch land in the Gunnison Country. Number 5, ranching is worth $50 million a year to the Gunnison Country economy. And lastly, water rights controlled by ranchers are absolutely vital in keeping water in the Gunnison Country. And we all know the Front Range will keep trying for it. The great Western painter and cowboy Charlie Russell, March 12, 1919, talked to a stock growers meeting in Miles City, Montana, and he said this to the ranchers: "Cow folks are scarce now, but I am glad of a chance to meet the few that still live. Most of my old friends either rode for or owned irons. Many of them across the big range, but they left tracks in history that the farmer can't plow under. Good or bad, they were regular men and women and America's last frontiersmen." Gary Cooper, narrating a film documentary, The Winning of the West, quoted an old cowboy who said, "It was a hard and lonely life, but by God, I'd like to do it all over again." And I'll finish off by quoting Arthur Chapman, 1888, in a great poem called Out Where the West Begins. "Out where the hand clasp is a little stronger, out where the smile dwells a little longer, that's where the West begins. Out where the sun is a little brighter, where the snows that fall are a trifle whiter, where the bonds of home are a wee bit tighter, that's where the West begins. Out where the skies are a trifle bluer, out where friendship's a little truer, that's where the West begins. Out where a fresher breeze is blowing, where there's laughter in every streamlet flowing, where there's more of reaping and less of sowing, that's where the West begins. Out where the world is in the making, where fewer hearts with despair are aching, that's where the West begins. Where there's more of singing and less of sighing, where there's more of giving and less of buying, and a man makes friends without half trying, that's where the West begins." And I would finish with, "Long live ranching and long live the West and long live the Gunnison Country." And I'm opening up my chat box now. And do we have anybody who came up with the answer to that trivia question?
Before we do get to that trivia question, I just wanted to make a quick note. One of the things that you discussed was that the Ute Indians had to be removed in order for ranching to be successful out here. So I just wanted to bring up the Bruneau Treaty that was that impacted the Ute people that were here in the 1870s and forcibly removed them onto the Los Pinos Indian Agency and then further on. Most of those people were Wiminuche, Tabawach, and Uncompahgre. There were up to 13 tribes at the time. Those were the 3 in the area, and that's why we know so many places named after those folks. After they were forcibly removed, many of them did come back, or there were some men that came back and helped work on some of those ranches. And there were still ceremonies when there was the White Buffalo Ranch, from what I understand as well. So just a little note on that history as well. Following the next guest that we had was Far Country.
No,
not
correct? Far Country. No.
The next one is Cheyenne Autumn from Deb.
He got it. Get Deb's
All
address.
Right.
Cheyenne Autumn. I watched John Ford directed that up Ohio Creek. Richard Widmar, Carl Malden, Carol Baker. They filmed the scene going over Mill Creek, and it took them all day to do it. Are there any questions that anybody has? We'll be happy to answer.
All right, we do have quite a few questions. Deb, I will shoot you an email to get your mailing address so we can get that book to you. You answered some of this question that came from Steve. Did the Gunnison area have cattle versus sheep wars?
Say it again, Nell.
It was a question that you may have already answered. Did the Gunnison area have cattle versus sheep wars?
Oh, they did. Yeah, there were three of them we mentioned, Taylor Park, Iola, and Obi Joyful. Rita Needham has a question about a chimney. I guess, I'm just trying to think, well, maybe that's not the tower. I'll have to ask Rita to redo that for me. Lynn Johnson said the Searchers, and that's another one that was made partly here. That's a good job. From Marianne Havens, Dr. Vandenbusche, do you read email? Absolutely. I don't send it. My student secretary sends it, but I read it. dvandenbusche@western.edu. Any other questions?
Yeah, Barbara Mason in the Q&A asked, do you have any cattle rustling stories?
Do I have any what?
Cattle rustling stories?
Paddle?
Cattle rustlers, cattle,
I don't know what the term is.
Cattle rustling, anybody who's stealing cattle, who's the outlaws in the area messing with the ranchers?
Cattle rustling.
Yeah.
You know, there was some rustling in the Gunnison Country, but they were usually run out or, well, nobody was hung, but it was pretty obvious that the Gunnison Stock Growers Association was very well aware of any of that if it ever went on. And in reading the papers and going through all the stuff, I never really saw anything in the Gunnison Country, unlike northwestern Colorado, where there was a lot. And I might point out that in northwestern Colorado in Browns Hole, that was on the Outlaw Trail. And that's where Butch Cassidy, a Sundance Kid, would go when they engaged in a bank robbery or rustled cows on their way into Wyoming. Anything else?
Any other questions, everybody? We had quite a few people that did get the answer right, but the book goes to who was the quickest, and that was Deb. So thanks. There's a lot of good ones out there. There's the Searchers as well. Somebody guessed the Unsinkable Molly Brown.
Yeah, that partly
part of that?
Partly here, yeah. How the West was won, partly here. I think it was the Unsinkable Molly Brown. I was there when Howard Keel was in the top of the Black Canyon singing a song in the echo. So if you see that in the Unsinkable Molly Brown, and incidentally, Debbie Reynolds was so in love with the area that she had a home up by Owl Pass outside of Ridgeway, and everybody I ever talked with said that she was just an absolutely fantastic person. Always wish I could have met her. Anything else? We're up for any questions.
I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Rita, we'll try to get back to your long questions and figure out what exactly, try to help you solve that question. One last question. What was the movie with the contrail cloud?
Cheyenne Autumn. Yeah,
Okay.
If you look at Cheyenne Autumn, it's supposed to be 1864, but they got jet trails in the sky in the movie.
All right.
Michael Guerreri, thank you for the comments. Yeah, thank you, Rita, did that for me.
Perfect. So again, thank you everybody for joining us. Please consider making a donation to not only support this program, but also to support a scholarship, the Vandenbushe Educational Scholarship for a local student to help them go to college next year. Also, please consider becoming a member to support the museum and to be the first to learn about programming like this. We've got really fun stuff coming up that is COVID conscious as well. And a big thank you to Duane. We sure appreciate being here every week with you.
Thank you, Nell, and thank you, everybody.
All right, we'll see you all next week.